I call Carmel Cipollone.
Mr Speaker, I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Matt Ducey said. Firstly, he was saying that my colleague Mr Twyford doesn't believe a word of what he was saying. Well, I can tell Mr Ducey he does, because he was in charge of writing the notes, and everything that was written down is what he believes in, unlike that speaker who was reading from a piece of paper and knew nothing about what he was talking about. Secondly, Mr Speaker, I just want to say the other thing that Matt Ducey said was that we on this side of the House are communists for opposing this bill. Well, Mr Speaker, can I just say that then he must be accusing the 75% of New Zealanders that disagree with the selling off of state houses, he must be saying they are also communists. I'm not sure about how the 75% of those New Zealanders feel, and actually 60% of national voters oppose the government's plan to sell off state houses. So that 60% of national voters, according to Matt Ducey, are communists as well. Mr Speaker, I think it's very clear from what I'm already saying that we oppose this bill. Our biggest concern here, Mr Speaker, is that this bill gives Ministers English and Bennett extraordinary powers to take direct personal control of selling state houses, exempting ministers from normal legal requirements and leaving the sale process wide open for corruption. And New Zealanders have a real interest in what's going on here, Mr Speaker. And so, of course, we're not going to support the idea that those two ministers be given extraordinary powers to make decisions without consulting or going through the normal process, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I want to just take this back to my own electorate and say that the #1 issue coming through my office doors, and I'm sure this is the same for every other electorate MP in this room, are housing issues. So firstly, for that government to say that we don't have a housing crisis in this country is absolute rubbish, and they know it. And secondly, we can't pretend that state housing is not part of the solution here. Now, what I've been really disappointed in, Mr Speaker, is the fact that that government have been so negligent that in order to meet their own ideological, philosophical aspirations, which is don't own these houses because they don't believe that the state should have a role in this, that they would allow these houses to continually become more and more run down under their watch, to the point, Mr Speaker, where we have cases in the media, public cases, where the coroner is stating that the #1 reason for the deaths of children are actually the housing that they're living in, and that government's responsible for that, Mr Speaker. So here we are in looking at a piece of legislation that will enable the national government to sell off housing, our state housing, but in the lead up to this, Mr Speaker, they've been doing everything that they can to make it look like the state can't manage the housing that they have. They have been deliberately doing a bad job of managing the housing that we have so that it adds weight to their case so that they can look like they're justified in selling it off. Mr Speaker, no one can do a better job of providing housing for New Zealanders that need it, the most vulnerable that need it, than actually New Zealanders. So the fact that they're even looking at selling these houses off to Australians has everyone in this country rolling their eyes, shaking their heads, shrugging their shoulders, because how can Australians look after our most vulnerable, take over our housing New Zealand stock and do a better job than what we can? Mr Speaker, it's an indictment on that government that there's been so many cases in the media recently about the state of the New Zealand housing stock that we do have. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about a couple of cases in my own electorate where it's actually that government's responsibility to do something about it, and they've done nothing. A case, Mr Speaker, where we have a young boy who's 10 years old, he has a disability, he can't get inside or outside of his house without being carried by his parents. The house can't be modified because of the way it is and the land that it's on. They can't get a transfer, despite the fact that we've been supporting them to get one, because there's not enough stock they can't get a transfer. And Mr Speaker, that child now has to be homeschooled because the mother can't carry that kid inside and outside of the house every day. And that is, Mr Speaker, what happens when we don't have the Housing New Zealand stock that is required. There are thousands, and I've seen this through my own Official Information Act requests, thousands of New Zealanders every month applying for Housing New Zealand houses. But how many of them are making it on the Housing New Zealand waiting list? Less than 1/5 of them are actually making it on that list. Are they applying despite the fact they don't need it? Well, are they applying even though they don't need it? No, they need it, Mr Speaker. It's not a case of people going, oh, where can I get an easy deal? I'm going to put my name forward for a Housing New Zealand house. They actually need it, but less than 1/5 of them are actually getting on the Housing New Zealand waiting list. And that government is trying to make out that there's not that much of a demand, but we know the number of people who are applying is not equating to the number of people that are on the lists, Mr Speaker. In recent months, we've seen examples where actually they've had the opportunity to pick up more houses, but they've chosen not to. And one of those examples was in the Waterview area, Mr Speaker, where a number of Housing New Zealand houses were purchased for the Waterview connection, which we support, but then were no longer required. And so 31 of those houses were no longer required for the project. And then who had the first right to purchase those houses? Housing New Zealand could have purchased them back. But despite the fact there are thousands of New Zealanders wanting Housing New Zealand houses, trying to get their name on the list, did Housing New Zealand take up that opportunity to purchase those houses back? No, they didn't. They didn't. They allowed it to go out for private sale, despite the fact that here they are constantly in the House, Nick Smith, everyone else, talking about the fact that they're doing whatever they can to be part of ensuring that they're meeting the housing demand. Well, actually, Mr Speaker, they're not. They want it to go private. They want to have no hand in this whatsoever. And you know what, Mr Speaker, it is history repeating itself. And so many New Zealanders have forgotten this, and we have to keep reminding them of this. The national government sold thousands of Housing New Zealand houses back in the 90s. And then when Labor got into government in 1999, the first thing they had to do was try and rebuild that stock. Now, in the process, there are a whole lot of houses that were run down as well, but here we are 9 years to try and rebuild the stock and try and fix those houses up. Maybe we didn't get to the point where we could have or we wanted to get to, but actually, Mr Speaker, we did try and rebuild that stock. And then now here we are in that same predicament with a national government who have not learnt from their mistakes, Mr Speaker, who have not changed their ideology in any way. And here we are, history repeating itself, selling off the Housing New Zealand houses again. And then what's going to happen is when their time is up, and New Zealanders decide, actually, we've had enough of a national government and what that means for this country, and Labor gets back in with whichever coalition partners we have at that time, then what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to rebuild that stock up and then try and do some work around the maintenance that has been neglected by the national government of our Housing New Zealand houses. Mr Speaker, selling off our Housing New Zealand houses is not the answer to the housing crisis that we have at the moment, and I think that actually the national government, all of their backbench MPs, all of their ministers should be embarrassed about what they're doing. Mr Speaker, we have a major housing crisis in this country, and it's not just about those who can't afford to buy houses, it's about those that can't even afford to rent a house, Mr Speaker. It's about those who can't afford to get out of the garage that they're living in because they don't have enough money to rent a house. They can't afford to get out of the car that they're living in because they can't afford to rent a house. And yet, that national government would rather sell off the Housing New Zealand stock that we have and take away one of the few opportunities that New Zealanders have to get into affordable housing. I think they should be ashamed of themselves, Mr Speaker, and we will not be supporting this bill.
Well done. Speaker.